The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 43 species gathered for what many considered the most important session in galactic history. Admiral Zyxthera of the Veltar Confederation adjusted her crystalline breathing apparatus, her four eyes scanning the assembled delegates with barely concealed anxiety. The war against the Devourers had raged for 18 months, and every major fleet engagement had ended in catastrophic defeat. "The situation grows more desperate by the day," announced High Counselor Murdoch, his scaled hide rippling with stress patterns that every species in the chamber could read. "The Devourer fleet has broken through the Kepler defense line. 3 more systems have gone dark in the past week alone." A collective shudder ran through the assembled delegates. The Devourers were unlike any enemy the galaxy had ever faced. They consumed everything in their path, converting organic matter into fuel for their ever-expanding war machine. Entire civilizations had been reduced to barren rocks in a matter of days. "We need reinforcements," Admiral Zyxthera said, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 lost battles. "My remaining ships can't hold the Arcturus sector much longer. The Devourers adapt to our tactics faster than we can develop new ones." The chamber fell silent. Every major military force in the galaxy had already committed their fleets. The proud Veltar Navy, masters of energy warfare, had lost 70% of their vessels. The Korthei ground forces, legendary for their tactical brilliance, had been overrun on dozen worlds. Even the technologically advanced Synthesis Collective had seen their automated defense networks systematically dismantled. "Perhaps," suggested Ambassador Quillara from the Peaceful Reach Coalition, her bioluminescent patches flickering with uncertainty, "it is time to consider less conventional options." "Such as?" High Counselor Murdoch's tail twitched with impatience. "The humans have offered their assistance multiple times. We have consistently declined their proposals." A wave of dismissive sounds swept through the chamber. Humans were widely regarded as a curiosity rather than a military power. Their homeworld, Earth, was located in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy. They had achieved faster-than-light travel only 3 centuries ago, making them practically infants by galactic standards. Most species had been exploring the stars for millennia before humans even discovered agriculture. The humans? Admiral Zyxthera's voice carried obvious disdain. "Their entire space force consists of perhaps 200 vessels. What possible difference could they make against an enemy that has destroyed fleets numbering in the thousands?" Ambassador Quilara's patches pulsed in a pattern that suggested careful consideration. "I have studied their military history extensively. While their technology appears primitive by our standards, their tactical approaches are unique. They employ strategies that no other species has ever considered." "Desperation is not a strategy," scoffed General Caxthor of the Rigid Hierarchy. His chitinous plates clicked together in a display of contempt. "Military science has evolved beyond their crude methodologies. There are established principles of warfare that have governed galactic conflicts for 10,000 years. And those principles have failed us repeatedly against the Devourers," Quillara pointed out. "Perhaps it is time to embrace the unconventional." High Counselor Murdoch raised a clawed hand for silence. "What exactly are the humans proposing?" Quillara activated her data display, projecting a holographic image of a human male with weathered features and keen eyes. "Fleet Admiral Harrison Chen of Earth's Expeditionary Force. He claims that human military doctrine can exploit weaknesses in devourer tactics that other species have overlooked." "Impossible," Admiral Zyxthera interjected. "Our greatest tactical minds have analyzed every engagement. The Devourers show no consistent weaknesses." "With respect, Admiral," Quillara continued, "human analysis suggests otherwise. They have identified what they call behavioral patterns in Devourer fleet movements. Apparently, humans excel at recognizing such patterns due to their evolutionary history as persistence hunters." General Caxthor's mandibles clicked in amusement. "Persistence hunters? They propose to hunt the Devourers across space?" "In a manner of speaking, yes. Admiral Chen believes that Devourer fleets follow predictable consumption patterns that can be exploited through what humans term asymmetric warfare. They wish to demonstrate these tactics in the Rigel sector." the chamber erupted in debate. Some delegates argued that humanity's offer represented their only remaining hope. Others maintained that involving such a primitive species would only waste precious resources and, potentially, compromise existing defensive positions. High Counselor Murdoch studied the human admiral's image with growing interest. There was something in the human's expression that reminded him of ancient predators from his own homeworld. A patient, calculating intelligence that seemed to see beyond immediate circumstances. What would they require? He asked finally. Minimal support, Quillera replied. They request only tactical intelligence regarding Devourer fleet compositions and movement patterns. They will provide their own vessels and personnel. And, if they fail? Then, we lose nothing we have not already lost. The Rigel sector is scheduled for evacuation anyway. Admiral ZYX-Thera's breathing apparatus hissed with frustration. This is madness. We are considering entrusting a critical sector to a species that still uses chemical propulsion for atmospheric flight. Their proposal includes detailed tactical analyses, Quillera said, projecting additional data. Human military theorists have studied our engagement records extensively. They claim that standard galactic doctrine relies too heavily on technological superiority and direct confrontation. They propose alternative approaches based on mobility, deception, and what they call force multiplication. Force multiplication? General Caxthor leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Using small forces to achieve disproportionate results. Humans apparently developed these concepts during their planetary conflicts. They specialized in situations where weaker forces defeated stronger ones through superior strategy and unconventional tactics. High Counselor Murdoch considered the proposal carefully. The galactic situation was desperate enough to justify almost any gamble. 3 more sectors would fall within the month if current trends continued. The total destruction of galactic civilization seemed increasingly inevitable. Very well, he announced. We will grant the humans their opportunity. Admiral ZYX-Thera, you will coordinate with their forces and provide necessary intelligence support. Admiral ZYX-Thera's 4 eyes widened in disbelief. High Counselor, I must protest. My remaining ships represent the last organized defense in the sector. Coordinating with untested human forces could compromise our entire position. Your current position is already compromised, Murdoch replied bluntly. The Devourers will reach Rigel Prime within 72 hours regardless of our actions. Perhaps human unconventionality will prove more effective than conventional defeat. The decision sent ripples of uncertainty throughout the chamber. Some delegates appeared relieved that any action was being taken. Others seemed convinced that desperation had finally overcome rational judgment. Ambassador Quillera transmitted the necessary coordinates to the human fleet. According to their communications, Admiral Chen's task force was already en route to the Rigel sector. They would arrive within 36 hours, well ahead of the projected Devourer assault. As the council session concluded, Admiral ZYX-Thera found herself reviewing human tactical proposals with growing bewilderment. Their strategies seemed to violate every established principle of space warfare. They proposed splitting their already small force into even smaller units. They planned to engage superior numbers without seeking technological advantages. Most incomprehensibly, they intended to deliberately expose themselves to enemy fire under specific circumstances. The human documents referenced historical conflicts with names like Thermopylae, Kenny, and Midway. ZYX-Thera accessed the galactic database but found only fragmentary information about primitive planetary warfare involving chemical weapons and metal projectiles. The tactical principles seemed utterly irrelevant to modern space combat. Yet something in the human analysis troubled her preconceptions. Their assessment of Devourer behavior patterns revealed insights that her own tactical staff had missed. Humans claimed that the Devourer's greatest strength was also their most exploitable weakness. Their relentless consumption patterns made them predictable in ways that could be turned against them. The next 36 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Devourer scouts were already probing the outer system defenses. Long-range sensors detected the main enemy fleet massing beyond the heliopause. Conservative estimates suggested at least 3,000 vessels, including the massive harvest ships that could strip a planet bare in hours. When the human task force finally arrived, Admiral ZYX felt her remaining hope evaporate entirely. The human fleet consisted of exactly 57 vessels, none larger than a Veltar heavy cruiser. Their ships appeared crude by galactic standards, with angular designs that seemed to prioritize function over elegance. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of energy shielding technology. The vessels relied on thick armor plating and what appeared to be primitive point defense systems. Admiral Chen's face appeared on ZYX command screen with remarkable clarity despite the primitive transmission technology. The human's expression conveyed calm confidence that seemed entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. Admiral ZYX Chen began, his voice carrying an accent that the translation system struggled to process. Thank you for agreeing to coordinate with our forces. I understand you have concerns about our tactical approach. Admiral Chen, ZYX replied carefully, your fleet appears smaller than anticipated. Our intelligence suggests the Devourer force numbers in the thousands. Chen's mouth curved in what humans called a smile. Numbers can be deceiving, Admiral. Sometimes the smallest force in the right place at the right time can change everything. May I review your current defensive positions? ZYX transmitted the tactical display, showing her remaining ships arranged in standard defensive formations around the system's inhabited worlds. The positions followed established doctrine, designed to maximize firepower concentration while protecting critical installations. Chen studied the display for several minutes, occasionally asking questions about ship capabilities and Devourer approach vectors. His analysis was methodical and precise, revealing a thorough understanding of three-dimensional space tactics despite humanity's limited experience with galactic warfare. I see the problem, Chen said finally. You're fighting their war instead of yours. I do not understand. The Devourers expect you to defend these positions. They've developed countermeasures for every defensive strategy you might employ. But they've never faced an opponent willing to abandon defensive positions entirely. Admiral ZYX breathing apparatus cycled rapidly in confusion. Abandon the defensive positions? That would expose the inhabited worlds to direct assault. Not if we eliminate the Devourer fleet first. Admiral, I'd like to propose a complete tactical revision. Instead of waiting for them to attack us, we're going to attack them. But not where or when they expect. The human admiral began outlining his strategy with growing enthusiasm. His plan violated so many fundamental principles of space warfare that ZYX found herself questioning whether the translation system was functioning properly. Yet as Chen explained his reasoning, certain aspects began to make disturbing sense. The Devourers had grown accustomed to fighting defensive opponents. Their entire tactical doctrine assumed that enemy forces would attempt to protect fixed positions. They had never encountered an opponent willing to sacrifice apparent advantages for strategic mobility. This is madness, ZYX whispered, but her voice carried more wonder than condemnation. Maybe, Chen acknowledged. But it's our kind of madness. Admiral, humanity has been fighting impossible odds for our entire history. We've learned that victory doesn't always go to the strongest force. Sometimes it goes to the most determined one. As the Devourer fleet entered the outer system, Admiral ZYX found herself implementing the most unconventional battle plan of her career. Every instinct screamed against abandoning established defensive positions. Every tactical principle she had learned warned against splitting forces in the face of superior numbers. But, as she watched the human ships move into their assigned positions with practiced precision, Admiral ZYX began to understand why the humans had earned such a strange reputation among the few species that had encountered them in combat. They moved with the confidence of predators who had never learned that some prey was too dangerous to hunt. The battle that would define humanity's place in galactic civilization was about to begin. The Devourer Vanguard entered the Rigel system with the same methodical precision that had crushed 47 previous star systems. Their biomechanical ships moved in perfect formation, each vessel a grotesque fusion of organic tissue and metallic components that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. The lead ships began their standard reconnaissance pattern, scanning for defensive installations and fleet concentrations. What they found defied all previous experience. The system appeared virtually undefended. Long-range sensors detected only scattered ship signatures in seemingly random positions. The heavily defended worlds they expected to find showed minimal military presence. Most confusing was the complete absence of the massive defensive formations that had characterized every previous engagement. Aboard the Devourer command vessel, the Prime Consciousness processed this unexpected data through millions of interconnected neural pathways. In 18 months of warfare, no enemy had ever voluntarily abandoned strong defensive positions. The behavior was so alien to galactic military doctrine that the consciousness initially suspected a sensor malfunction. Deep scans confirmed the readings. The Veltar fleet, previously concentrated around Rigel Prime, had dispersed throughout the system in small formations. More puzzling still, numerous unidentified vessels had appeared alongside the Veltar ships. These new contacts used primitive technology that barely registered on advanced Devourer sensors. The Prime Consciousness reached the only logical conclusion. The defenders had panicked. The arrival of the Devourer fleet had shattered their morale, causing them to abandon coordinated defense in favor of desperate flight. This psychological collapse had been observed before, though usually much later in an engagement. The consciousness issued new directives to the fleet. Standard consumption protocols would proceed ahead of schedule. With enemy resistance effectively eliminated, the harvest ships could begin planetary processing immediately. The scattered defender vessels would be eliminated as convenient targets of opportunity. 3,000 Devourer ships surged forward with increased velocity, their biomechanical hulls rippling with anticipation. The easy victory would allow them to process the Rigel system's considerable resources efficiently before moving on to the next target. Admiral Chen watched the enemy formation from his flagship's bridge, noting their increased speed with grim satisfaction. The Devourers had reacted exactly as human analysts had predicted. Their relentless consumption patterns made them incapable of recognizing tactical deception that diverged from standard galactic doctrine. All units, this is actual, Chen transmitted on the encrypted tactical frequency. Enemy has taken the bait. Initiating Phase 2 on my mark. 57 human ships had positioned themselves throughout the Rigel system according to a battle plan that would have horrified any conventional admiral. Instead of concentrating firepower, they had deliberately scattered across millions of cubic kilometers of space. Each small formation occupied positions that appeared tactically insignificant by galactic standards. But Admiral Chen had not learned warfare from galactic textbooks. His tactical education came from human military history, where desperate circumstances had forged innovative strategies that turned weakness into strength. The Rigel system would become a classroom where humanity taught the galaxy a lesson in unconventional warfare. Admiral ZYX, are your ships in position? Chen inquired. The Veltar Admiral's response carried obvious tension. Confirmed, Admiral Chen. Though I must repeat my concerns about this deployment pattern. Admiral ZYX commanded the largest concentration of Allied ships, positioned near Rigel Prime in what appeared to be a traditional defensive formation. Her 23 remaining vessels represented the most powerful conventional force in the system, but Chen's plan required her to use them in a way that violated every principle of fleet tactics she had ever learned. Trust the process, Admiral, Chen replied calmly. Your people have been fighting this war the same way for 18 months. How has that worked out? The pointed question silenced ZYX objections. The Veltar Confederation had lost more ships than any other species in the war against the Devourers. Conventional tactics had proven worse than useless against an enemy that adapted faster than defenders could innovate. Throughout the system, human ship commanders prepared for the most complex fleet engagement in their species' short spacefaring history. Each captain had studied detailed tactical analyses of previous Devourer encounters, identifying patterns that had escaped galactic attention for months. The enemy's greatest strength was their coordination, but coordination required predictable communication patterns that could be exploited by opponents clever enough to recognize them. The Devourer fleet divided into 3 primary attack formations as they entered the inner system. The largest group targeted Rigel Prime, drawn by the concentration of Veltar ships that appeared to represent the primary defensive force. Smaller formations moved toward the system's industrial worlds and orbital facilities, following established consumption protocols that prioritized resource acquisition. They ignored the scattered human vessels entirely. Long-range analysis suggested the primitive ships posed no meaningful threat to biomechanical hulls designed to withstand weapons far more advanced than anything humanity possessed. The human formations appeared to be fleeing toward the system's outer edge, confirming Devourer assumptions about Defender morale collapse. Phase 2, Execute, Admiral Chen commanded. What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. The scattered human formations suddenly accelerated toward predetermined intercept coordinates, their movement patterns revealing the true purpose of their deployment. They had not been randomly positioned throughout the system. Instead, they had established a three-dimensional web that could respond to enemy movement from multiple angles simultaneously. The Devourer's first indication of danger came when human ships began launching missiles from extreme range. The weapons themselves seemed primitive by galactic standards, using chemical propulsion and conventional warheads that posed little apparent threat to advanced biomechanical armor. Devourer point defense systems easily intercepted the majority of incoming missiles. But the humans had not expected their weapons to penetrate enemy defenses. The missile strikes served an entirely different purpose. Each successful interception created debris clouds that interfered with Devourer sensors. More importantly, the missiles carried sophisticated electronic warfare packages that began broadcasting interference across multiple communication frequencies. The Devourers found their coordination networks degrading as static replaced clear tactical data. Admiral Chen had studied the enemy's greatest strength and turned it into a vulnerability. The Devourer fleet's perfect coordination depended on instantaneous communication between thousands of vessels. Disrupt that communication, and their tactical superiority vanished. All units, weapons free, Chen announced. Show them what humans do to bullies. The real attack began as human ships closed to effective weapons range. Their tactics bore no resemblance to standard galactic fleet engagements. Instead of forming battle lines or seeking technological advantages, they attacked in small groups that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Human ships would emerge from behind asteroids or planetary bodies, deliver devastating close-range attacks, then disappear before Devourer forces could respond effectively. Their primitive armor proved surprisingly effective against biomechanical weapons designed to penetrate advanced energy shields. The Devourers had optimized their armaments for fighting opponents they understood, not for dealing with enemies who deliberately chose inferior technology for tactical advantages. Captain Maria Santos commanded the destroyer squadron assigned to harass the enemy's left flank. Her 3 ships had hidden behind Rigel 7's largest moon, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Devourer scouts passed their position, she led her formation in a slashing attack that destroyed 6 enemy vessels before vanishing back into the moon's sensor shadow. That's for Alpha Centauri, she transmitted on the tactical frequency, referencing a human colony that had been evacuated just ahead of a Devourer assault 6 months earlier. Similar attacks erupted throughout the system as human formations implemented what they called wolf pack tactics. Named after Earth predators that brought down much larger prey through coordinated attacks, the strategy maximized human advantages while minimizing their technological disadvantages. The Devourer command structure began showing signs of strain as their perfect coordination dissolved into chaos. Individual ship commanders found themselves making independent decisions without central guidance. The Prime Consciousness struggled to process tactical data corrupted by electronic interference and rapidly changing battle conditions. For the first time in 18 months of warfare, a Devourer fleet was reacting instead of dictating the terms of engagement. Admiral ZYX watched the human tactics with growing amazement and horror. The humans were deliberately seeking close combat with enemies that outgunned them individually by factors of 10 or more. Their ships sustained damage that would have crippled Veltar vessels, yet continued fighting with apparent indifference to their own losses. Admiral Chen, she transmitted, your ships are taking severe casualties. Do you wish to withdraw to safer engagement ranges? Chen's response came accompanied by the sound of explosions in the background.
His flagship had apparently taken direct hits but remained operational. Negative, Admiral. We're just getting started.
The human admiral's calm tone suggested he considered current losses acceptable, even expected. This attitude baffled ZYX-Thera, whose tactical training emphasized preservation of ships and crew as primary objectives. Humans seemed to view their vessels as expendable tools rather than precious resources.
But, as the battle continued, ZYX-Thera began to understand the human approach.
Their ships were designed differently from galactic vessels. Where other species built sleek, elegant craft optimized for specific roles, humans constructed crude but versatile platforms that could continue functioning even after sustaining massive damage. A human destroyer that had lost half its weapons systems continued launching missiles. A cruiser venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches maintained its attack run against a devourer capital ship.
Human crews displayed the same indifference to personal safety that characterized their tactical doctrine. All Veltar units, prepare for Phase 3, Admiral Chen announced. Time to show these things what real firepower looks like. Admiral ZYX-Thera felt a chill of recognition.
Throughout the engagement, her conventional fleet had maintained defensive positions around Rigel Prime, appearing to await the main Devourer assault. The enemy had consistently moved to attack her formation, drawn by the concentration of firepower that represented their most significant threat. But, the human plan had never intended for ZYX-Thera to fight defensively.
All ships follow human attack vectors.
Close to optimal firing range and engage with maximum firepower. The Veltar fleet abandoned their defensive positions and charged directly at the approaching Devourer formation. Their energy weapons, more advanced than anything humanity possessed, began tearing through biomechanical hulls that had been weakened by sustained human attacks. The combined assault caught the Devourers completely unprepared. Their tactical doctrine assumed that galactic opponents would maintain predictable engagement patterns. The sudden transition from defensive to offensive posture violated every expectation built into their strategic algorithms. Devourer casualties mounted rapidly as human harassment tactics merged with Veltar firepower superiority. The enemy found themselves caught between opponents who fought with entirely different doctrines, making coordinated response impossible. But, the Devourers were not helpless. Their fleet still outnumbered the combined human Veltar force by more than 3-1.
Slowly, grimly, they began adapting to the new tactical environment. Biomechanical hulls started reconfiguring themselves to resist human weapons.
Communication protocols shifted to frequencies less susceptible to electronic interference.
The prime consciousness reached a new tactical assessment.
The primitive species that had seemed so insignificant possessed capabilities that had escaped previous analysis. Their willingness to accept casualties in exchange for tactical advantages represented a form of warfare that galactic civilization had never developed. But, adaptation was the Devourer species' greatest strength. They would learn from this engagement and ensure that such tactics never succeeded again. Admiral Chen recognized the shift in enemy behavior and knew his window of opportunity was closing. The Devourers were beginning to counter human tactics through the same adaptive intelligence that had made them unstoppable against conventional opponents.
All units, initiate final phase. It's time to finish this. The last phase of the human battle plan was the most audacious yet.
Admiral Chen ordered his remaining ships to concentrate on a single target that had been identified through careful analysis of Devourer fleet composition. Deep within their formation, protected by hundreds of escort vessels, was the command ship that housed the prime consciousness. Destroying that ship would not eliminate the Devourer threat entirely, but it would cripple their coordination for hours or days.
Long enough for human tactics to achieve decisive victory before the enemy could adapt.
Admiral ZYX-Thera, we need your biggest guns concentrated on these coordinates, Chen transmitted, highlighting the target.
Can your ships punch through that much protection? ZYX-Thera studied the tactical display with professional assessment.
Possible, but only if we can get close enough for optimal firing solutions. That would require sacrificing most of our remaining ships. That's the plan, Chen replied simply.
Sometimes you have to pay the price for victory. The final assault began with a coordinated attack by every human ship still capable of combat.
They charged directly at the Devourer Formation Center, accepting devastating casualties to clear a path for the Veltar fleet's approach. Human vessels exploded in brilliant flashes of light, their crews choosing death over defeat.
Admiral ZYX watched in stunned silence as humans deliberately sacrificed their ships to achieve tactical objectives.
The behavior was so alien to galactic military thinking that she initially suspected some form of technological malfunction.
No rational species would accept such losses for marginal advantages.
But, as the human sacrifice opened gaps in the Devourer formation, ZYX began to understand the true nature of human warfare. They fought not just with weapons and technology, but with a willingness to pay costs that other species considered unacceptable. "All Veltar ships, follow me in," ZYX commanded, leading her remaining vessels through the gap the humans had bought with their lives. The final exchange lasted less than 10 minutes, but those minutes would reshape galactic civilization forever.
Veltar energy weapons, guided by human tactical analysis and enabled by human sacrifice, found their target. The Devourer command ship's biomechanical hull couldn't withstand concentrated fire from multiple directions simultaneously.
When the command vessel exploded, taking the prime consciousness with it, 3,000 Devourer ships suddenly lost their coordination. Individual vessels continued fighting, but the perfect tactical integration that had made them unstoppable vanished in an instant. The battle was won, but at a cost that horrified every galactic observer. Humanity had committed 57 ships to the engagement. When the fighting ended, only 12 human vessels remained operational, and most of those were barely functional. Yet as Admiral Chen transmitted his final battle report to the Galactic Council, his voice carried the same calm confidence that had characterized his entire approach to the engagement.
Mission accomplished. Rigel system secured.
Ready for further orders. Admiral ZYX stared at the tactical display showing the scattered debris of human ships and realized that everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare had just changed forever. News of the victory at Rigel spread through the galactic communication networks with unprecedented speed. Within hours, every major species had received detailed reports of how a primitive human fleet had achieved what 18 months of conventional warfare had failed to accomplish. The reaction was immediate and profound. In the crystal spires of the Veltar homeworld, military analysts worked frantically to understand tactical principles that violated everything they had been taught. How had 57 crewed vessels succeeded where fleets numbering in the thousands had failed? The raw data seemed impossible, yet multiple sensor records confirmed the same incredible sequence of events. High Commander Velthis, the Confederation's supreme military authority, stood before a holographic recreation of the battle while her staff attempted to explain human tactics. The three-dimensional display showed human ships moving in patterns that defied logical analysis. They deliberately exposed themselves to enemy fire, reported her chief tactical officer, his voice carrying obvious bewilderment. "Our doctrine has always emphasized avoiding unnecessary casualties through superior positioning and technology. Yet their approach proved effective," Velthis observed, studying the human suicidal charge against the Devourer command ship. "What does this suggest about our own tactical assumptions?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. The Veltar military had prided itself on sophisticated warfare that minimized losses while maximizing technological advantages. Human tactics seemed to mock that entire philosophy by achieving victory through apparent recklessness. Similar discussions were occurring across the galaxy as military leaders grappled with implications that extended far beyond a single battle. The humans had not just defeated the Devourers, they had revealed fundamental flaws in galactic strategic thinking that had persisted for millennia. On the Korthai military fortress of Durthak, General Supreme Vexiron reviewed human tactical manuals that had been hastily translated from Earth databases. The documents described something called maneuver warfare that emphasized speed, flexibility, and psychological effects over pure firepower. "They speak of getting inside the enemy's decision cycle," he explained to his assembled commanders. "Rather than meeting strength with strength, they seek to disrupt enemy coordination through rapid, unpredictable attacks." The concept challenged everything the Korthai understood about proper military organization. Their armies relied on precise coordination and overwhelming force applied at critical points. Human tactics seemed to embrace chaos as a weapon, accepting confusion and casualties that disciplined forces would never tolerate. But the results at Rigel could not be dismissed. A human fleet had accomplished in hours what galactic forces had failed to achieve in over a year of warfare. In the research laboratories of the Synthesis Collective, artificial intelligences struggled to process tactical data that seemed to violate logical parameters. The Collective's quantum computing networks had analyzed every previous battle against the Devourers, developing sophisticated models that predicted enemy behavior with mathematical precision. Those models had consistently failed to account for human tactical choices that appeared to be based on emotional rather than rational decision-making. How could any species voluntarily accept casualty rates that threatened unit cohesion? Why would commanders order attacks that offered only marginal advantages at enormous cost? Primary Node 77 Alpha requested additional data from its human contacts, hoping to understand the psychological factors that enabled such seemingly irrational behavior. The response from Earth's military academies introduced concepts that the Collective's databases had never encountered. Humans spoke of morale and fighting spirit as measurable combat factors. They described training programs designed to overcome natural self-preservation instincts. Most puzzling of all, they treated individual sacrifice for group success as not just acceptable but admirable. The Collective's analysis algorithms struggled to process these concepts. Their tactical modeling had always assumed that rational beings would prioritize survival over abstract objectives. Human behavior suggested that cultural factors could override biological imperatives in ways that created entirely new tactical possibilities. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Devourers were conducting their own analysis of the Rigel defeat. The surviving ships had transmitted vast amounts of combat data before retreating to regroup beyond the galactic rim. That information painted a disturbing picture of an enemy unlike any they had previously encountered. The Great Convergence, the distributed intelligence that guided Devourer strategy, processed the tactical data through billions of interconnected nodes. Every previous opponent had followed predictable patterns based on resource conservation and logical decision-making. The humans had violated those patterns so completely that Devourer adaptation protocols had been overwhelmed. New strategic imperatives began flowing through the Convergence's command networks. The human species represented a threat that required immediate attention. Their tactical innovations could not be allowed to spread to other galactic civilizations. If humanity's approach to warfare became widely adopted, it would neutralize the Devourer's primary advantages. Orders went out to the scattered fleet elements throughout the galaxy. All available forces would concentrate for a massive assault on human space. The species that had dared to challenge Devourer supremacy would be eliminated before their tactical concepts could contaminate galactic military thinking. But the Devourers were not the only ones planning new campaigns. In the aftermath of Rigel, human military leaders found themselves inundated with requests from species that had previously considered Earth an insignificant backwater world. Admiral Chen returned to Earth's orbital command stations to discover that his small fleet had triggered a transformation in humanity's galactic status. Diplomatic envoys from dozens of species waited to discuss military cooperation agreements. The same civilizations that had dismissed human offers of assistance now competed for access to human tactical expertise. The Altarians want to establish a joint training program, reported General Sarah Mitchell, Earth's military liaison to the Galactic Council. The Rigelian Assembly has requested detailed analysis of our electronic warfare capabilities. Even the Synthesis Collective is asking for consultation on adaptive tactics. Admiral Chen studied the diplomatic requests with mixture of satisfaction and concern. Humanity had proven their worth on the battlefield, but that success brought new responsibilities and dangers. The galaxy was beginning to understand that humans represented more than just another minor species with primitive technology. What about the Devourers? Chen asked. Do we have intelligence on their response to Rigel? General Mitchell's expression grew somber. Long-range monitoring stations have detected massive fleet movements beyond the galactic rim. Our analysts believe they're massing for a major offensive, probably targeting human space directly. Chen nodded grimly. He had expected this response. The Devourers could not allow human tactical innovations to spread without mounting a decisive counterattack. The victory at Rigel had bought the galaxy time, but it had also painted a target on humanity's homeworld.
Begin implementing Defense Plan Omega, Chun ordered.
If they want to test human resolve on our own ground, we'll give them a lesson they won't forget.
Defense Plan Omega represented the culmination of human military thinking applied to interstellar warfare.
Unlike the galactic civilizations that built massive defensive installations, humans had designed a strategy based on mobility and depth.
Earth's defenses would not try to stop an enemy attack at the system's edge. Instead, they would draw the Devourers into an environment where human tactical advantages could be maximized.
The plan required transforming the entire Sol system into a three-dimensional battlefield where every asteroid, moon, and planetary body became a potential weapons platform. Human engineering teams began converting mining stations into hidden missile bases.
Cargo haulers received stealth modifications that would allow them to operate as commerce raiders.
Even civilian vessels were equipped with basic armaments and trained for supporting roles in what promised to be the most decisive battle in human history. But Earth's preparations represented only part of humanity's response to the growing crisis.
Admiral Chen understood that defeating the Devourers would require more than military innovation. It would demand a fundamental change in how galactic civilization approached warfare.
Human military advisors began working with allied species to adapt their tactical doctrines.
The process proved challenging, as many civilizations had cultural barriers that made it difficult to accept human approaches to warfare.
The Veltar, despite their experience at Rigel, struggled with tactics that emphasized accepting casualties for strategic advantage. Their society valued individual lives too highly to embrace the human willingness to sacrifice ships and crews for tactical objectives. The Korth AI found human mobility concepts difficult to implement with their rigid command structures. Thousands of years of military tradition had created bureaucracies that could not adapt quickly enough to exploit fleeting tactical opportunities. The Synthesis Collective faced even greater challenges, as their artificial intelligences found it nearly impossible to replicate human intuition and adaptability.
Logical decision-making processes could not substitute for the creative thinking that enabled humans to recognize unexpected opportunities.
Yet gradually, incrementally, galactic military doctrine began to evolve. Species that had fought the same way for millennia started experimenting with human concepts adapted to their own capabilities and limitations. The changes were often subtle, but they represented the beginning of a tactical revolution that would reshape interstellar warfare. The transformation was not limited to military affairs. Humanity's success at Rigel had demonstrated that galactic civilization's technological assumptions were not the only path to power. Species that had been marginalized by their lack of advanced technology began to reconsider their own capabilities. The Zephyrians, whose homeworld had been written off as too primitive for galactic membership, suddenly found their expertise in atmospheric warfare highly valued. The crystalline entities, previously dismissed as too alien for meaningful cooperation, proved to possess unique sensory capabilities that enhanced electronic warfare effectiveness. Human victory had shown that diversity of approach could be more valuable than uniformity of technology. The galaxy began to appreciate tactical innovations that had been overlooked for centuries simply because they diverged from accepted doctrine. As these changes rippled through galactic civilization, the Devourers continued their preparations for what they intended to be a final solution to the human problem. Their fleet concentration had grown to unprecedented size, drawing ships from conflicts throughout the galaxy. More than 10,000 vessels were massing for an assault that would dwarf any previous military operation. The Great Convergence had analyzed human tactics extensively and believed it had identified effective countermeasures.
Devourer ships were being modified to resist electronic interference.
Command structures were being decentralized to reduce vulnerability to coordination disruption. Most importantly, the psychological factors that enabled human tactical flexibility were being studied as potential weapons. The Devourers had concluded that humanity's greatest strength was their willingness to accept losses that other species considered unacceptable.
If that psychological resilience could be broken, human tactical advantages would evaporate.
The coming battle would test not just human military capability, but the fundamental nature of human character.
Admiral Chen understood that more than Earth's survival was at stake.
The approaching conflict would determine whether humanity's tactical innovations could survive contact with an enemy that had learned from previous defeats. If the Devourers succeeded in crushing human resistance, the galaxy would lose its best hope of developing new approaches to warfare. But Chen also knew that humanity had been preparing for this confrontation since the moment they first looked up at the stars and wondered what might be waiting in the darkness. Every conflict in human history had been preparation for the ultimate test of their species' ability to adapt and overcome. As Devourer scouts began probing the outer edges of human space, Chen issued his final preparations order to the Sol Defense Force.
Remember, we're not just fighting for Earth.
We're fighting for the right to exist as ourselves, to think our own thoughts, and to face the universe on our own terms.
Show them why that matters.
The greatest battle in galactic history was about to begin, and, with it, the final test of humanity's place among the stars. The Devourer fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system like a dark tide washing across the stars. 10,347 vessels of various configurations emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with malevolent energy.
Long-range sensors aboard Earth's monitoring stations struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the approaching force.
In the command center buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Admiral Chen studied the tactical displays with the calm expression that had become his trademark. The enemy fleet was larger than intelligence estimates had projected, but the size advantage had been anticipated.
Human defensive doctrine had never relied on matching enemy numbers ship for ship.
"Defensive sectors report ready status," announced Captain Rodriguez from her position at the communications console. "All stealth platforms are in position and maintaining communications silence." Chen nodded, reviewing the holographic display that showed the Sol system as humanity had transformed it over the past 6 months. To external sensors, the system appeared lightly defended, with only a few hundred human vessels visible in standard orbital patterns around the major worlds.
The Devourers would see exactly what human planners wanted them to see.
The reality was far different. Hidden throughout the asteroid belt, concealed in the shadow of moons and planetary rings, embedded within seemingly innocent cargo containers, thousands of weapon platforms waited in perfect silence. The entire system had become a trap designed to exploit every lesson learned from 18 months of studying Devourer tactics. "Enemy fleet is maintaining standard approach vector," reported the sensor officer.
Estimated time to Mars orbital distance is 47 hours at current velocity.
Chen had expected this approach pattern. The Devourers invariably targeted inhabited worlds first, consuming population centers before moving on to industrial facilities. Their psychological warfare doctrine assumed that destroying civilian targets would break enemy morale and force advantageous surrender terms. They had never fought an opponent who considered civilian casualties as motivation rather than deterrent.
"Transmit general order to all units," Chen commanded. "Execute Plan Thermopylae on schedule. Remind all commanders that timing is critical to mission success."
Plan Thermopylae was named after an ancient Earth battle where vastly outnumbered defenders had held a superior force long enough for their civilization to prepare more comprehensive resistance.
The modern version would use the same principles on an interstellar scale.
As the Devourer fleet continued its approach, the first phase of human resistance began with actions so subtle that even careful observation might miss their significance. Cargo vessels throughout the system began adjusting their courses slightly, changing their orbital patterns in ways that appeared random but followed carefully calculated schedules. Mining platforms in the asteroid belt activated secondary thrusters that had been disguised as routine maintenance equipment. Scientific research stations powered up sensor arrays that had been secretly converted to military applications. Communication satellites began transmitting on frequencies that seemed to carry routine civilian traffic but actually coordinated the most complex military operation in human history. The Devourers detected these activities but dismissed them as typical panic responses from a primitive civilization facing inevitable destruction. Previous opponents had shown similar patterns of disorganized activity when confronted by superior forces. The Great Convergence allocated minimal attention to what appeared to be desperate but ineffective civilian evacuation attempts. This assessment proved to be the first in a series of critical errors. Aboard the Devourer command ship, the consciousness that had replaced the prime consciousness destroyed at Rigel analyzed the approaching target with growing confidence. Humanity's homeworld represented a different challenge than the Rigel system, with its complex orbital dynamics and multiple inhabited bodies, but the tactical principles remained unchanged. The new prime consciousness had studied human tactics extensively and believed it understood their limitations. Human flexibility came at the cost of coordination.
Their willingness to accept casualties could be exploited by inflicting losses faster than they could adapt. Most importantly, their entire strategic doctrine depended on psychological factors that could be undermined through overwhelming displays of force. The consciousness issued directives to implement what it termed cascade demoralization protocols. Instead of the methodical consumption approach used in previous systems, the Devourer fleet would demonstrate its overwhelming superiority through simultaneous attacks on every inhabited world in the Sol system. The psychological impact would shatter human resistance before their tactical innovations could be effectively deployed. It was a logical plan that would have succeeded against any conventional opponent. But the Devourers were about to learn that conventional assumptions did not apply to humanity. 47 hours after their arrival, the Devourer fleet reached Mars' orbital distance and began dividing into attack formations. The largest concentration targeted Earth directly, while smaller groups moved toward the lunar colonies, the orbital habitats around Jupiter, and the research stations scattered throughout the outer system. Admiral Chen watched the enemy deployment with professional interest.
The Devourers were spreading their forces exactly as human planners had hoped, creating multiple separate engagements that would prevent them from supporting each other effectively. "All units, this is actual," Chen transmitted on the main tactical frequency. "Enemy has committed to simultaneous attacks on multiple targets.
Execute Phase 2 as planned."
What happened next would be remembered as the moment when human military doctrine proved its effectiveness on the largest possible scale. The civilian cargo vessels that had been adjusting their positions throughout the system suddenly revealed their true nature. Concealed weapon systems deployed from cargo bays that had appeared to contain mining equipment or agricultural supplies. Ships that had seemed to be fleeing in panic reversed course and began attacking Devourer formations from completely unexpected angles. The asteroid belt, which long-range scans had identified as containing only standard mining operations, erupted with weapons fire from platforms that had been invisible to Devourer sensors. Missiles launched from concealed launchers that had been disguised as ore processing equipment. Energy weapons emerged from installations that had appeared to be simple research facilities. But the most devastating surprise came from the stealth platforms that had been positioned throughout the system over the past 6 months. Using technology derived from human submarine warfare, these vessels had maintained perfect concealment while moving into optimal attack positions. When they finally revealed themselves, they were already inside Devourer defensive perimeters. Captain Elena Vesquez commanded one of these stealth platforms, a converted asteroid mining ship that had been equipped with the most powerful weapons humanity could produce. Her crew had spent 3 months in perfect silence, watching Devourer scouts probe the system's defenses while maintaining their concealment. "Target acquired," announced her weapons officer. "Devourer heavy cruiser, range 4,000 kilometers. Fire," Vasquez ordered simply. The mining ship's concealed particle beam cannon, powered by a reactor that had been designed to crack asteroids, struck the Devourer vessel with energy levels that no primitive species should have possessed. The biomechanical hull, designed to resist advanced galactic weapons, proved vulnerable to crude but devastatingly powerful human technology. Similar attacks erupted throughout the system as dozens of stealth platforms revealed their positions. The Devourers found themselves under attack from weapons they couldn't see, using targeting data they couldn't intercept, fired by opponents who had learned to turn technological inferiority into tactical advantage. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Devourer formations that had never experienced surprise attacks began showing signs of confusion as their perfect coordination faltered. Ship commanders found themselves making independent decisions without guidance from command structures that were struggling to process tactical data that made no logical sense. Admiral Chen monitored the engagement through sensor feeds from across the system, watching as human innovations proved their worth against the galaxy's most dangerous enemy. But he also knew that the current success was only the beginning of a much longer battle. "All Earth defense units, prepare for close engagement," he ordered. "They're going to adapt faster than we'd like.
Chen's prediction proved accurate. Within hours of the initial attacks, Devourer ships began reconfiguring their hulls to resist human weapons. Electronic warfare suites were modified to detect stealth signatures that had previously been invisible. Command protocols shifted to decentralized patterns that reduced vulnerability to coordination disruption. The Great Convergence was learning from each exchange, developing countermeasures that would neutralize human tactical advantages. But the process required time, and time was a resource that human planners intended to exploit ruthlessly. Phase 3 of the Human Defense Plan began with the most audacious gambit yet attempted in interstellar warfare. Instead of waiting for the Devourers to complete their adaptation process, Admiral Chan ordered a general offensive by every human vessel in the system. The attack violated every principle of defensive warfare. Logic suggested that defenders should preserve their forces while allowing attackers to exhaust themselves against fortified positions. Human doctrine embraced the opposite approach, using maximum aggression to prevent enemies from implementing their own tactical plans. 800 human vessels, supported by allied ships from a dozen species that had arrived to assist Earth's defense, launched simultaneous attacks against Devourer formations throughout the Sol system. The assault was coordinated through communication networks that the enemy still hadn't learned to intercept effectively. The battle that followed redefined the concept of space warfare. Human ships attacked with the same suicidal determination that had characterized the Rigel engagement, but on a scale that dwarfed any previous conflict. They accepted catastrophic losses to achieve tactical objectives that seemed insignificant by galactic standards but proved decisive when combined with the overall strategic plan. Commander Sarah Kim led a squadron of modified freighters in a direct assault on a Devourer formation protecting the approach to Earth. Her ships were converted cargo vessels that had been armed with every weapon humanity could produce, their holds filled with ammunition instead of trade goods. "Remember, we're buying time for the orbital platforms to reposition," she transmitted to her crews. "Every minute we hold them here is a minute the big guns get to work." Kim's squadron lasted exactly 14 minutes against enemies that outgunned them by orders of magnitude. But those 14 minutes allowed Earth's orbital defense platforms to complete targeting solutions that would have been impossible without the distraction her attack provided. When the freighters were finally destroyed, their sacrifice enabled the planet's most powerful weapons to engage the Devourer formation at optimal range and angle. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but it resulted in the destruction of 47 enemy vessels at the cost of Kim's entire squadron. Similar exchanges occurred throughout the system as human commanders implemented tactical principles that treated individual battles as components of larger strategic objectives. They were not trying to win every engagement, but to create cumulative effects that would achieve decisive advantage over time. The Devourers had never faced opponents who approached warfare as a mathematical equation where acceptable losses could be calculated against strategic gains. Their own tactical doctrine emphasized preservation of resources combined with overwhelming technological superiority. Human willingness to exchange losses for position gained violated their fundamental understanding of rational military behavior. But, as the battle continued, the Great Convergence began to recognize patterns in human tactical choices. Their apparent recklessness followed sophisticated calculations that maximized strategic effect while minimizing actual long-term costs. The humans were not being suicidal, they were being more ruthlessly logical than any opponent the Devourers had previously encountered. This realization led to a fundamental shift in Devourer strategy. If human tactical flexibility came from their willingness to accept short-term losses for long-term gains, then, the optimal countermeasure was to make those losses so catastrophic that even human psychology could not sustain them. The Great Convergence issued new directives to all fleet units. Standard consumption protocols were suspended in favor of what it termed total elimination doctrine. Every human vessel, platform, and installation would be targeted for complete destruction regardless of tactical significance. The goal was no longer system conquest but species extermination. Admiral Chen recognized the shift in enemy tactics and knew that the battle had entered its most critical phase. The Devourers were attempting to break human morale through the application of overwhelming force. It was a logical response to human tactical innovation, and it might well succeed if humanity's resolve proved insufficient to sustain the losses required for victory. All units, this is actual, Chen transmitted on all frequencies. Enemy has shifted to Total War protocols. Execute final phase authorization. It's time to show them who we really are. The final phase of humanity's defensive plan was the most desperate gambit in their military history.
Instead of preserving their remaining forces for continued resistance, they would commit everything to a single decisive engagement. Every ship, platform, and weapon in the Sol system would be thrown against the Devourer fleet in an attempt to achieve victory through sheer audacity. It was a plan that could succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically. But it was also the most human response possible to an enemy that threatened everything humanity held sacred. As orders went out across the system for the final assault, Admiral Chen took a moment to consider the magnitude of what they were attempting. 10,000 enemy vessels against fewer than 2,000 human platforms and ships. Technology that had evolved over millennia against innovations that were barely centuries old. The mathematical odds of success were so small as to be effectively non-existent. But mathematics had never been humanity's greatest strength. Their advantage lay in the willingness to attempt impossible things simply because they were necessary.
The final battle was about to begin. The final phase of the Sol system defense began with an action that defied every conventional understanding of military logic.
Admiral Chen ordered every single human vessel, platform, and installation to simultaneously attack the vastly superior Devourer fleet. No reserves were held back.
No fallback positions were prepared.
Everything humanity had built in space would be committed to one desperate assault. The order spread through the human communication networks like wildfire. On orbital stations around Earth, crews who had spent their entire lives in peaceful scientific research found themselves manning weapons they had learned to operate only weeks before. In the asteroid belt, miners who had never seen military service activated missile systems they had helped install in the cargo holds of their ships. Throughout the outer system, colonists and researchers prepared to join an attack that could end either in glorious victory or total annihilation. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Park commanded the Orbital Research Station Darwin, which had been hastily converted from studying cosmic radiation to housing the most powerful sensor array in human space. Her crew of 37 scientists and technicians had volunteered to participate in what everyone understood might be a suicide mission.
All stations report ready for final engagement, she announced over the communications system. Remember, our job is to provide targeting data for the fleet. We stay operational as long as possible, no matter what. Park Station would not survive the coming battle.
Its orbital position made it an obvious target for Devourer weapons, and research stations were not designed to withstand military-grade assault.
But the targeting data her sensors could provide might make the difference between human victory and extinction. Throughout the Sol system, similar preparations were taking place as humanity prepared to demonstrate the ultimate expression of their military philosophy.
They would not merely fight against impossible odds, they would embrace those odds as the crucible in which their true character would be revealed. The Great Convergence observed these preparations with something approaching confusion.
No rational species would commit their entire defensive capability to a single engagement when gradual attrition offered better long-term survival prospects.
The human decision to abandon all strategic reserves violated every principle of logical military planning. But the Convergence had learned to be wary of human tactical choices that seemed irrational. Their analysis protocols had been updated to account for psychological factors that purely logical systems found difficult to process.
If humanity was committing everything to this engagement, they must believe they possessed advantages that were not apparent from external observation. The Convergence ordered increased vigilance from all fleet units and began implementing additional adaptive protocols. Whatever surprises the humans had prepared, Devourer forces would be ready to counter them through superior coordination and technological flexibility. The assault began at exactly 14:30 Earth Standard Time with a coordinated missile barrage from every human platform in the system. Thousands of projectiles, ranging from sophisticated military weapons to converted mining charges, streaked toward Devourer formations across millions of kilometers of space. The missiles carried conventional warheads, nuclear devices, antimatter charges, and experimental weapons that human engineers had cobbled together from whatever materials they could find.
The Devourer point defense systems activated automatically, tracking and destroying incoming threats with mechanical precision. Their biomechanical hulls had been specifically adapted to resist human weapons based on data from previous engagements.
The missile barrage would cause minimal actual damage to the enemy fleet.
But Admiral Chen had never expected the missiles to penetrate Devourer defenses. Like every other phase of the human battle plan, the initial attack served purposes that extended far beyond its apparent objective. Each missile carried sophisticated sensor packages that transmitted detailed information about Devourer defensive capabilities, ship configurations, and fleet positioning. More importantly, the overwhelming number of simultaneous targets forced the enemy to reveal the full extent of their defensive systems, providing human tacticians with critical intelligence about vulnerabilities that had remained hidden during previous engagements. Sensor data is streaming in from all platforms, reported Captain Rodriguez from her position at Admiral Chen's command center.
Enemy defensive patterns are exactly what our models predicted.
Chen studied the incoming intelligence with growing satisfaction.
18 months of analyzing Devourer tactics had revealed patterns that even their adaptive intelligence could not completely abandon.
The enemy's greatest strength was their coordination, but coordination required predictable communication protocols that could be exploited by opponents clever enough to recognize them.
Execute Operation Beethoven, Chen ordered, activating the most sophisticated electronic warfare program humanity had ever developed.
Operation Beethoven was named after a human composer whose works had demonstrated that complex harmonies could be created through the interaction of simple individual components. The military version applied the same principle to electronic warfare, using hundreds of separate transmitters throughout the Sol system to create interference patterns that would disrupt Devourer coordination without being traceable to any single source. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the Devourer fleet, communication networks began experiencing cascading failures as human interference patterns interacted with their adaptive protocols in ways the Great Convergence had not anticipated. Ships that had maintained perfect formation for decades suddenly found themselves isolated from central command guidance.
Commander Thane Harrison led the attack group targeting the enemy fleet's left flank, flying a converted passenger liner that had been armed with every weapon the colonial shipyards could produce. His formation consisted of 12 civilian vessels that had volunteered for what everyone understood was a one-way mission.
"Remember, we're not trying to destroy their entire fleet," Harrison transmitted to his crews. "We just need to keep them busy long enough for the real surprises to deploy." Harrison's ships attacked with the suicidal determination that had become humanity's trademark, closing to point-blank range before unleashing everything they carried. The converted passenger liner's dining halls had been filled with missile launchers. Its cargo bays housed particle beam cannons that had been stripped from orbital defense platforms. Even the luxury suites had been converted to ammunition storage. The attack lasted exactly 7 minutes before Harrison's formation was completely destroyed. But those 7 minutes allowed human stealth platforms to approach their targets undetected while Devourer attention was focused on the obvious threat. Similar diversionary attacks erupted throughout the system as human commanders implemented tactics that treated individual ships and crews as expendable components of larger strategic objectives. The psychological impact on Devourer forces was profound. No enemy had ever demonstrated such willingness to accept immediate losses for minimal apparent gain. But the diversions were merely preparation for humanity's final gambit. While Devourer forces engaged the obvious attacks, the true threat was approaching from directions they had never learned to consider. Admiral Chen had studied the historical records of every successful underdog victory in human military history. The pattern was always the same: inferior forces achieved victory by changing the fundamental nature of the conflict, forcing superior opponents to fight on terms that neutralized their advantages. The Sol system defense would follow that pattern on an interstellar scale. "All stealth platforms, commence final approach," Chen ordered. "Operation David is authorized for immediate execution." Operation David was humanity's ultimate expression of asymmetric warfare. Instead of trying to match Devourer firepower ship for ship, they had identified the single point of failure that could cripple the enemy's greatest advantage. 37 human vessels had spent months approaching the center of the Devourer formation using stealth technology that rendered them effectively invisible to enemy sensors. Their hulls were coated with materials that absorbed sensor radiation. Their power signatures had been reduced to levels barely above background radiation. Most importantly, they had learned to move in patterns that mimic the gravitational effects of space debris. These ships carried humanity's most desperate weapon, experimental devices that had been designed by human physicists working from theoretical principles that even they didn't fully understand. The weapons were essentially controlled gravitational anomalies that could disrupt the space-time fabric in localized areas. The technology was so dangerous that testing had been impossible. Mathematical models suggested the devices would work as intended, but they could just as easily tear holes in reality that would consume everything within light years. Humanity was literally betting their existence on weapons that might destroy their own solar system. Captain Elena Martinez commanded the lead stealth vessel, a converted deep space explorer that had been rebuilt around a single gravitational disruption device. Her crew consisted of volunteers who had accepted that their mission would almost certainly end in death, regardless of whether it succeeded. Target acquired, announced her weapons officer, Lieutenant Park, whose steady voice betrayed no hint of the magnitude of what they were attempting.
Devourer command ship bears 043 Mark 15, range 8,000 kilometers. Arm the device, Martinez ordered. All crews, this is actual. Remember, we're doing this for every human child who deserves to grow up free. Make it count. The gravitational disruption device activated with a sound that transcended normal physics, creating vibrations that seemed to originate from the fundamental structure of space itself. Reality warped around the weapon's focal point as artificial gravitational fields interacted with the natural curvature of spacetime. The effect on the Devourer command ship was instantaneous and catastrophic. The vessel's biomechanical hull, designed to resist conventional weapons, proved helpless against forces that operated on the level of atomic structure. Molecular bonds dissolved as gravitational stress exceeded the tolerance of matter itself. But the destruction of a single ship, even the command vessel, would not be sufficient to cripple a fleet of 10,000. Captain Martinez knew that her mission required one additional element that would transform tactical success into strategic victory. Activate secondary devices, she ordered, knowing that the command would seal her crew's fate. The gravitational disruption weapon had been designed with a feedback mechanism that would overload its containment systems, creating a much larger gravitational anomaly that would affect everything within a 1,000-kilometer radius. The effect would destroy Martinez's own ship along with every other vessel in the immediate area, but it would also cripple the Devourer fleet's command structure. Similar explosions erupted throughout the enemy formation as 37 human crews simultaneously triggered their weapons. The gravitational anomalies interacted with each other in ways that even human physicists had not fully predicted, creating a cascade of spacetime distortions that propagated through the Devourer fleet like a virus. Ships that had maintained perfect formation for centuries suddenly found their navigation systems failing as local gravity fields fluctuated beyond all prediction. Communication networks collapsed as the exotic particles generated by gravitational disruption interfered with every known form of electromagnetic transmission. Most critically, the Great Convergence itself began experiencing processing failures as the quantum coherence required for its distributed intelligence was disrupted by gravitational chaos. For the first time in Devourer history, their perfect coordination vanished entirely. Admiral Chen watched the tactical displays with growing amazement as reports streamed in from across the system. The gravitational weapons had exceeded their most optimistic projections, creating a level of disruption that reduced the enemy fleet to individual ships operating without central guidance. All units, this is actual, Chen transmitted on all frequencies. Enemy coordination is compromised. Execute general attack. Show them what happens when they threaten our home. The final assault began as every remaining human vessel in the Sol system converged on the disorganized Devourer fleet. Ships that had been hiding behind asteroids, platforms that had been disguised as space debris, stations that had maintained perfect stealth for months, all revealed themselves simultaneously in a coordinated attack that exploited every lesson humanity had learned about asymmetric warfare. The battle that followed was unlike anything in galactic military history. Individual Devourer ships still possessed superior technology and firepower, but their greatest advantage had been neutralized. Without coordination,
they were reduced to fighting as separate units against enemies who had learned to operate as a unified system despite overwhelming technological inferiority. Human vessels swarmed through the enemy formation like ancient Earth fighter aircraft, using superior agility and tactical flexibility to offset the enemy's individual superiority. They attacked in coordinated groups that appeared and vanished before Devourer responses could be effectively coordinated. Captain Sarah Kim, flying one of the few surviving stealth platforms, led a formation of converted mining ships against a cluster of Devourer heavy cruisers. Her vessels were crude, their weapons primitive, their armor barely adequate. But they moved with purpose and coordination that their opponents could no longer match. "Target the command sections," Kim transmitted to her formation. "Remember, we're not trying to destroy them completely. We just need to mission kill enough ships to make this fleet combat ineffective." The human attack succeeded beyond all expectations. Devourer ships that had seemed unstoppable when operating as a coordinated fleet proved vulnerable when forced to operate independently. Their adaptive intelligence required time to develop effective countermeasures, and human tactics denied them that time through relentless pressure applied from multiple directions simultaneously. Within 6 hours of the gravitational weapon deployment, the Devourer fleet had been reduced from 10,000 functional vessels to fewer than 3,000. The remainder were fleeing toward the edge of the system, their coordination networks too damaged to maintain effective resistance. Admiral Chen issued the final order of the Sol System Defense: all units, pursue and harass enemy withdrawal. Ensure they understand that humanity is not to be underestimated again. The pursuit continued for 18 hours as human forces demonstrated that their tactical innovations could be applied to offensive operations as effectively as defensive ones. By the time the surviving Devourer ships escaped to hyperspace, they carried with them the knowledge that humanity represented a fundamental challenge to everything they thought they understood about warfare. In the aftermath of the battle, Admiral Chen stood on the observation deck of Earth's primary orbital station, looking out at a system transformed by conflict. Debris from thousands of destroyed vessels drifted through space, testament to the price both sides had paid for victory. But, among that debris, human recovery teams were already beginning the process of rebuilding. The victory at Seoul had been more than a military success. It had been a demonstration that human approaches to warfare could succeed against any opponent, regardless of their technological advantages or tactical sophistication. News of the battle would spread throughout the galaxy, carrying with it the understanding that humanity had earned their place among the stars through courage, innovation, and an absolute refusal to surrender. As reports came in from across the galaxy, Admiral Chen learned that the effects of the Sol defense were already being felt throughout galactic civilization. Species that had been fighting losing battles against the Devourers were beginning to experiment with human tactical concepts. The rigid military doctrines that had governed galactic warfare for millennia were being questioned and modified. Humanity had not just won a battle. They had started a revolution in military thinking that would reshape interstellar conflict for generations to come. The galaxy would never again underestimate the species that had proven that courage and determination could overcome any technological disadvantage. Admiral Chen smiled as he watched human ships moving through the debris field, already beginning preparations for the next challenge. The Devourers would return eventually, probably with new adaptations designed to counter human innovations. But humanity would be ready, because they had learned the most important lesson of all, that victory belonged not to the strongest or most advanced, but to those who refused to accept defeat. In a universe full of ancient civilizations and advanced technologies, humanity had carved out their place through the oldest virtues of all: courage in the face of impossible odds, sacrifice for the greater good, and the absolute determination to protect what they held dear. The galaxy had finally understood why humanity's reputation preceded them wherever they chose to fight.